introduced the widely now accepted three bubble or three dimensions or three strands of sustainable development items, which emphasizes the importance of integrating not only economic growth, but also environmental sustainability and social development altogether. That is to say, Rio 1992 really gave us the contribution that sustainable development is not just about the environment, it's about social and economic development as well, and really about integrating all three of them together. The second important thing that happened in Rio 20 years ago at the Earth Summit was it created, or modernized, one might say, the global sustainable development architecture, in which you have essentially three players with relatively well-defined roles. The first are governments, who are in effect the real players, who do the negotiations, who make the international conventions that then become in effect international legal frameworks within which global sustainable development issues are decided. Now in this context, the United Nations, the UN, is not a player. It's rather the playing field, or the forum, or the venue at which the players play. And in this respect, when the United Nations is blamed for a failure of a summit or is credited the success of a summit, to some extent that's a little bit misleading, because if your team loses, you don't blame the stadium in which the team played in, you blame your team. Or if your team wins, you don't credit the stadium for the victory, you credit your team. So I think that's an important distinction to make. But also very important in 1992 was that it represented or saw the legitimation of civil society, both global NGOs and local community-based organizations, as having a legitimate role to play in sustainable development policy in general. And many of us, when we think of the Earth Summit in Rio 1992, think of the Think Globally, Act Locally slogan. That really came from civil society, from the idea that while governments and the UN are doing big things at the global scene, it really falls to each of us and small groups and communities to organize ourselves to make a difference for sustainable development in our local context. Next slide, please. I think it's important to mention a few other things that happened at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. One of them was that the so-called Rio Principles for Sustainable Development were approved by governments. These are 21 principles that essentially create a mandate for governments and the world more broadly to work for sustainable development and create a sort of overarching conceptual framework or paradigm to guide work on thinking about sustainable development. The second important thing that happened, additionally, at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 was that a number of global framework conventions were approved. One of these was on climate change. If we didn't have the Rio Earth Summit in 92, we wouldn't have the Climate Change Global Convention, we therefore wouldn't have the Kyoto Protocol, we wouldn't have the framework that is now in place for the global regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. As imperfect as that framework may or may not be, it would not happen without Rio in 1992. Likewise, there was a global framework convention adopted at Rio in 92 for biodiversity. Shortly thereafter, there was a global framework convention adopted on desertification. And this is the international, these are the international legal frameworks that guide global work and oftentimes national and subnational work on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. Something else that happened at Rio 20 years ago was the Global Environmental Facility was created. In other words, a financing mechanism to fund projects of global environmental significance was created. And so when we think about the Earth Summit 20 years ago, we see a combination of conceptual emphasis on integrating the social and economic and environmental dimensions of sustainability or sustainable development, as well as the creation of missing pieces for global sustainable development, namely the Rio Principles, the institutional framework describing the roles of government, the UN, civil society, the legal basis in the form of these global conventions, and financing mechanisms. Next slide, please. So this is important when we think about Rio+20, 20 years later, because it was conceived, at least by governments, as a review conference to review the progress made in implementing the decisions taken at Rio 20 years ago at the Earth Summit. And this is not a tremendously ambitious mandate. It's one thing to try to save the world, 1992, something else to see 20 years on how we've actually done. And I would suggest that many of the criticisms of what happened at Rio+20 reflect the belief that it wasn't enough simply to review what has been done, but more ardent or robust steps were called for. That may or may not be true, but that was never conceived of as the purpose of Rio+20, at least by the governments and the UN that organized a big chunk of the conference. So if we look at the conference agenda for Rio+20, what were the main items? Well, essentially, there were two or three. The first was the green economy. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Second was moving towards sustainable production and consumption, structures, institutions, and decisions. The third was the institutional framework for sustainable development. But what does this actually mean? Next slide, please. This is really a paradigmatic question of how these concepts are understood, how they relate to sustainable development, and what sustainable development means in the overall scheme of things. One of the questions that we oftentimes pose in the UN and UNDP is, what is the relationship between sustainable development and people? And in UNDP, we have a somewhat related approach to sustainable development, which we call human development, which I suspect you, participants in the summer school on human development, know a great deal about. One question that comes up is, well, what's the difference between sustainable development and human development as paradigms? Are they the same? Are they different? Are there tensions? And I believe strongly, and I think this is an important point to make. If we look at the first Rio principle that was accepted as the Sustainable Development Principle in Rio at the Earth Summit 20 years ago, it says, quote, "Human beings are at the center of concern for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature." Well, this is human development, right? The idea that development should be people-centered, that it should be about people, opportunities for productive life being as large and as robust as possible. But I think if you take the equity and equality principles or emphases that are such a strong part of human development, and you expand those emphases away from a single generational focus to an intergenerational focus, then you quickly get the idea that just as one person's development aspirations at a given point in time shouldn't occur at the expense of another person's aspirations at that same point in time, we should also say that the aspirations for development today, for people living today, should not occur at the cost of development aspirations for people in the future. So in that sense, the equity and equality principles that underpin human development are really intergenerational and reflect very much the logic of sustainable development, which is development in the future should not be compromised for the sake of development today. So I really don't think there's a, if you like, paradigmatic incompatibility between these two issues, or between these two concepts, sustainable development and human development. And this has never really, in practice, I don't think, come up as a problem when governments negotiate these issues. Next slide, please. And this is in contrast to the green economy paradigm, which in practice has proven to be quite controversial and filled with tension. And this is one of the problems that really manifested itself in Rio+20 and the negotiations leading up to it over the past year. Many developing countries have come to understand the green economy as essentially excluding or somehow downplaying poverty reduction and the social dimension of sustainable development. So if you look at the three-bubble diagram of sustainable development, many developing countries saw the green economy or see the green economy as essentially dealing only with the intersection of the economic growth and the environmental sustainability dimensions of sustainable development. Related to that was the fear that if the green economy were adopted as a global development paradigm, it could be used as a justification for new conditionality from the developed countries of the North with regards to aid, development assistance, with regard to trade, which would in turn limit their development possibilities. Maybe it's brown development, maybe it's not sustainable development, but many developing countries, especially resource-based economies, believe that just as the North developed on the basis of coal and oil and steel and some brown industries, that they need to have the right to do that as well, at least for a time, and most of the adjustment to a greener economy has to in fact be done by the North, because they've already captured the benefits of having relatively brown development patterns. And then the third source of opposition to the green economy is opposition to the use of market or economic tools to value or commoditize nature. So essentially, the green economy is seen by many as reflecting the logic of let's value what nature is worth in order to put a price on it so that its value can be compared to other social outcomes. And there are some governments which find this unacceptable as a matter of principle. And so for all of these reasons, the green economy as a paradigm has proved to be very contentious and not helpful in the context of the Rio negotiations. Next slide, please. Let's now turn to the question of what actually happened at Rio+20. And I think to answer the question, we have to realize that there were almost two separate Rios, or two separate sets of events that happened at Rio+20 in June. And those can be described as top-down versus grassroots events. The top-down events are the process of the intergovernmental negotiations that produced the Rio+20 outcome document that has attracted so much criticism. And the second, grassroots, really referred to the other things that happened at Rio+20, and I will argue that there are many more reasons for optimism and a positive assessment of Rio+20 if we look at the grassroots dimension than at the top-down dimension. Next slide, please. What actually happened with the top-down negotiations that led to the outcome document that was agreed upon by governments at Rio+20 last month? Well, one thing that happened was the green economy was very much watered down. It essentially became, quote, the green economy in the context of poverty reduction and sustainable development. This was necessary to address the concerns about poverty reduction and social development that many developing countries had, but essentially then the concept was reduced to sustainable development, something we already had, and it didn't really provide any new conceptual or legal basis for development work for sustainable development. If we look at sustainable production and consumption, essentially the outcome document, I would argue, paid lip service. These are desirable goals, we're all in favor of them, but no concrete commitments or steps were made by governments to address these issues. If we look at the institutional framework for sustainable development, what happened with the outcome document? Well, much of the negotiations centered on the United Nations Environmental Program, the piece of the UN that deals with environmental issues as its mandate. UNEP was strengthened, but not transformed. And that was a disappointment to many people who saw much stronger UNEP leading the UN to play a more robust role dealing with global environmental and sustainable development issues. The outcome document did call for the creation of a new Global Sustainable Development Forum and remained rest in the outcome document. In my personal view, the most important component of the outcome document pertained to the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which the outcome document specifies will replace the Millennium Development Goals after 2015. As you may know, the Millennium Development Goals are a global framework to essentially reduce poverty in the world's poorest countries. This framework ends in 2015, and the question is, what is going to follow the MDGs? Well, the Rio outcome document calls for Millennium Development Goals to be replaced by sustainable development goals that will monitor progress not just towards poverty reduction, but towards sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals are to address all three dimensions of sustainable development, the economic, the social, and environmental, and they are also to apply to developed as well as developing countries. So, manage and monitor progress in sustainable development globally, that principle can be applied to all countries. How that will work in practice remains to be seen, but still it's, in my view, quite a positive outcome. Next slide, please. Now, of course, many people are disappointed and critical of the outcome document. They see a lot of things missing. No new money was put on the table. Many people saw a lack of urgency in the outcome document, although to some extent this was predetermined by the nature of Rio+20 itself, being this review conference. Many critics are disappointed in the absence of a willingness to tackle difficult issues like sustainable production and consumption. I think it's important to ask why this happened, because answers to those questions, I think, tell us a great deal about the state of the world today. Well, first, as I mentioned before, the mandate for Rio+20 was as a review conference, which is relatively unambitious. But going beyond that, I think we have to recognize that there are some major differences, major objective differences in the world regarding how serious the nature of these problems are. In some ways, this comes down to the question of whether one believes in the strong sustainability hypothesis or weak sustainability hypothesis. In other words, do you believe that in order to be sustainable, it is possible for development to go on indefinitely substituting essentially physical and financial capital for natural capital? That's to say, using up more and more fossil fuels, using up more and more natural resources, and replacing them with more machines to raise labor productivity, raise incomes, and solve poverty that way? Or do you believe that, in fact, we are running out of these resources? We are at risk of fundamentally altering and damaging the ecosystems on which our livelihoods depend. And as a result, we really need to have dramatic immediate changes in the way the economy works. Reasonable people have different views on this question. The science is stronger in some areas, weaker in other areas in terms of environmental sustainability. So this is, I think, one area where we have some questions. Another way in which these objective issues manifest themselves is depends an awful lot on your perspective. If you are living in, say, Western Europe or the United States, you don't see an awful lot of immediate consequences of environmental degradation. Okay, maybe it's a little bit hotter, so you just turn up the air conditioning. Maybe gasoline or petrol is a bit more expensive, but you can afford it. By contrast, if you live in a small island developing state, somewhere in the South Pacific or in the Caribbean, every day you see the implications of climate change. You see saltwater infecting freshwater supplies. You see sea levels rising. You see hurricanes becoming more frequent, doing more damage to your coastal infrastructure. Every day you see real economic costs that affect people's lives as a result of climate change. And so people in the US or Western Europe, to some extent, maybe forget for actually thinking that these issues are perhaps less burning, less important than people living in small island developing states. Linked to this is the fact that the economic and fiscal circumstances in Western Europe, in the United States, and in Japan at the moment are quite unfavorable. And this makes it hard for them to commit to putting up more money, fresh money, for sustainable development initiatives that would occur largely in other parts of the world. And this, in my view, relates to a broader picture of what problem, which is that the world has changed in many respects fundamentally since 1992, since the Earth Summit was created and set in motion many of these processes that we're discussing. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most important way in which the world has changed in the context of Rio and negotiations between governments is that the traditional negotiating blocks of North and South and the paradigms that underpin those negotiations are breaking down. And it used to be possible for the North to agree with the South on certain solutions, and those agreements would stick. To some extent, the Rio Principles of 1992 reflected that. But now, if you look at both the North and the South, they're increasingly fragmented into different constituencies that make it much harder for these major groupings to agree among themselves and therefore to agree with one another. So let's take, for example, the issue of adopting binding climate change mitigation targets to deal with global warming. If we look at the North, we see that the European countries are major proponents of climate change mitigation. These are countries that in the European Union and some other countries like Norway and Switzerland have really made sacrifices in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of increasing energy efficiency, in terms of dramatically raising energy prices. They signed up to the first commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol. They instituted the emissions trading system. That's one part of the North. The part of the North is the United States, but really very little has happened. The U.S. never signed on to Kyoto, commitment period. It doesn't have a national emissions trading system. Energy prices are much lower than in Europe, etc. Well, if the North can't have a certain approach, common approach to climate change, how can the South agree? But then let's look at the South. Most countries in the G77 believe that the adoption of binding climate change mitigation is only for the North. And countries like China and India say that there's an historical legacy that belongs to the North, creating the problems of climate change, and they should pay the cost. The North should deal with consequences. That's not fair to ask Chinese and Indians, who are much poorer, to pay for these costs, even though the aggregate, China and India are significant contributors of greenhouse gases. But then we have in the developing states to say, no, we don't have time for this. The Chinese and the Indians need to commit to binding climate change mitigation targets just as the North does. Well, this makes it hard for the South to come to a common view on what the appropriate approach to climate change should be, and harder, therefore, for the North to agree with the South. So that's one example. Let's take also the example of strengthening UNEP. Here again, we see major divisions between the North and the South. Europe has been a major proponent of strengthening UNEP. The U.S. was against strengthening UNEP. Most of the G77 was opposed to strengthening UNEP. They were afraid it would turn into a so-called green policeman. But the African countries within the G77 are, by contrast, the largest proponents for strengthening UNEP. So what's the point? We have this fragmentation of the North-South space that underpins the negotiations that are essential to coming to some kind of agreement on issues discussed at Rio+20. Next slide, please. There are some other important ways that the world has changed in the last 20 years. And this has implications for what kind of agreements can be made in forums like Rio+20. The first concerns money. Yes, there was no new money put on the table at Rio+20, but money in the form of official development assistance, development aid, is much less important than it used to be for developing countries especially. ODA is much smaller than flows of capital, flows of trade, or even flows of remittances. So yes, there's no new money on the table. That may not matter so much when we look at Rio+20. The second way in which the world changed is that the role of north to south transfers is less important than it used to be. And this is true not only for money, but also in terms of expertise. Developing countries are increasingly coming up with their own solutions, reflecting their own experiences to their development problems. So the North doesn't really have as much to offer the South as it did 20 years ago. And what this reflects is, in some basic sense, shifts in the tectonic plates that underpin the global political economy. We have the rise of new donors, countries like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that are increasingly relevant on the global stage that underpin the work of the G20, for example. And when they become development actors, what they do really matters in ways that didn't matter 20 years ago. Likewise, when we look at development cooperation, we see foundations, international foundations, like the Gates Foundation, or the Open Society Institute, since we're here at CEU, playing a growing role as donors. And then we have the so-called South-South cooperation, where developing countries, even ones that aren't necessarily large donors, are increasingly providing expertise and technical support to other southern countries. So this wasn't the case years ago, and it's changing the development landscape significantly. Next slide, please. It's posing new challenges to development cooperation. One of them is that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that was agreed upon at Rio 20 years ago is really coming under threat. This principle basically says, yes, threat of environmental degradation is a common threat that all countries of the world face, but the responsibilities for responding to this threat must be differentiated, understood as the South doesn't have to respond anywhere near as much as the North has to respond, because the North did most of the damage. Well, in some sense, that's true historically, but if we look at climate change today, China is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and China and India, as well to get on board. But is this compatible with the common but differentiated responsibilities principle? And this is something of a conundrum for developing countries that want to see progress on climate change, but don't want to give up a basic principle of Rio 20 years ago, which is in some sense very favorable to them, and I would suggest appropriately so. Second challenge is, how can development cooperation work? How can it be effectively coordinated when everyone is a donor and everyone is playing by different rules? The developed countries, if you like, of the North, the countries in the OECD, DAC, have essentially agreed upon the rules for how to do development cooperation. There are conditionalities associated with this. They emphasize human rights, gender, result-based programming. These are not the rules that the Chinese, or the Brazilians, or the Indians play by, nor are they the rules that the global foundations play by. So the more we have different countries, different players with different rules, the harder it is to coordinate what goes on, the more overlapping and inefficiency, and in some respects wasted outcomes, wasted opportunities in development cooperation we have. This also is part of the backdrop. It makes it harder to agree at Rio+20. Next. So if we want to be pessimistic, we can look at the outcome document, be concerned, and see all the reasons why this happened and why the world is in some respects in a difficult place. But there are also sources for optimism that can be found at Rio that reflect, if you like, its grassroots nature, or what might be called a big tent nature, which says that what happened at Rio was not about the outcome document, but rather the fact that Rio was a local convocation for civil society, a global trade fair where concrete solutions for sustainable development problems were discussed and accelerated and facilitated, not by governments, but by civil society and by the private sector. Or not only by governments, I should say, but by governments together with civil society and the private sector. What do we mean by this? Well, there are a number of concrete manifestations of this grassroots elements of Rio+20 that are worth calling attention to. The first is that more than $500 million in commitments, mostly from the private sector, for concrete sustainable development activities were pledged. I'll talk more about those in a minute. And also the Rio dialogues, so-called, occurred at Rio, which represented a new form of global social media e-democracy that saw real-time participation of citizens all over the world in what was happening at Rio through essentially social media and internet platforms. And that has very interesting implications for the future as well. Next slide. What these grassroots elements suggest is that we can have a more compelling vision of how to do sustainable development. One that does not require unanimous agreement among governments, one that is based on easily understood concrete examples and can inspire and support actions based upon the thinking globally but acting locally paradigm. And as a result of these activities, I think it's clear that even if we look at the outcome document, these activities push the outcome document to be more ambitious than it would have been, but also reduce the importance of the weaknesses in the outcome document. Next slide, please. So let me give you some concrete examples of these grassroots outcomes. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon last year launched the Sustainable Energy for All campaign. According to this campaign, the world by 2030 should provide universal access to modern energy services. Well, why is this an issue? As of 2009, there were 1.3 billion people in the world without access to reliable electricity services. There were 2.7 billion people without access to clean cooking facilities. People who heated their homes and cooked their food by burning firewood, dung, plant husks, and this is a very bad way to deal with not only environmental issues, but also with public health. The campaign also pledged to double the share of renewables in the global energy mix by 2030, and also to double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency globally by 2030. Now, $323 billion is a nice chunk of change. Most of the pledges for this came from the private sector, not from government. Now, I'm not saying all of that money is going to materialize tomorrow, but some will. And that's going to make a concrete difference to the lives of people who are living without electricity and modern cooking facilities. A second example of things that happened at Rio that didn't really involve government was that Greenpeace led or launched a campaign to limit energy extraction, unsustainable fishing practices in the Arctic. We got a lot of potential, a lot of press, a lot of attention, and it's difficult to imagine Greenpeace being able to do this in a more persuasive and better covered way from a media perspective. And third, at Rio+20, a petition with 1 million signatures calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies was presented to world governments. Well, the G20 governments have promised to phase out subsidies for fossil fuels. They promised this in 2009. Since then, not a lot has happened. Now Rio comes along and there's this petition signed by 1 million people. It's hard for governments to duck their commitments, their obligations, their promises. Rio is a great opportunity for, if you like, calling attention to these commitments and making it harder for them to be forgotten about. Next slide, please. The Rio Dialogues. The Rio Dialogues are, and they're going on, a virtual platform for creating and voting on sustainable development proposals, concrete proposals. Hundreds of experts from universities, NGOs, in the first quarter of 2012, prepared concrete sustainable proposals that were then put online on a platform that actually the UADP designed and helped the Brazilian government maintain. And via this platform, 60,000 people cast 1.4 million votes on these proposals, on ending fossil fuel subsidy, on protect areas to promote biodiversity, on reducing air and water pollution, very concrete things. The 10 most popular proposals, in turn, that got the most votes, were submitted to the world leaders at Rio+20. Now, the extent of this influence of this remains to be seen. I think it probably at the margin made world leaders a bit more willing to have a more robust, ambitious outcome document because they had the sense that there were a lot of people that knew what was going on and were weighing in on this. But I think that what's really interesting is the question of the future. Could this sort of thing be a platform for direct e-democracy at global summits as a way of having the global public be participants in these sorts of meetings going forward? Next slide. Now, I don't need to be too optimistic about the commitments about the Rio dialogues. There are obviously risks and challenges that are posed here. There's always the question of will commitments, will pledges be real? Will there be? There's always the risk of greenwash, where corporations that make billions of dollars from, if you like, exploiting the environment will whitewash or greenwash themselves in environmental propaganda, or will blue-wash themselves by using the UN as a fig leaf for their perhaps not sustainable activity. I think realistically that we'll see some of both. We'll see some greenwash and some blue wash, but we will also see some commitments being followed through, and this will make a concrete difference in people's lives. The Rio dialogues, maybe some of you participated in these, and you may have your own views on how well these work. Clearly, 60,000 people voting is not 7 billion people. It's much less than 1/10 of 1% of the global populace, so one shouldn't wax too eloquently about democracy at work. If you look at the proposals that were approved, their wording, their logic is a bit problematic. Some of these proposals are aspirational, some of them are concrete activities, some of these are outcomes. It's sort of a bit of a conceptual mishmash. I think the most important question is it realistic to propose this vision of the UN serving as a big tent where not only governments negotiate, but the private sector and the NGOs all come together to meet, to have this consultation, this deal making, and have it all come together in something that makes sense. Even if we believe that Rio did this in June, it's not clear it will be able to do, the UN will be able to do this in the future. It's not clear that the governments will pay to have the UN do this in the future. So these are all things that we have to be thinking about going forward. Next slide, please. But nonetheless, I think that if we think about Rio+20, what's important is not the document that was agreed upon by governments, but this vision of a big tent that combines intergovernmental negotiations, private sector deal-making, NGO-led campaigns, direct real-time e-democracy for including the global public. And I think if we recognize that there's a chance this model could take hold for how to do global sustainable development conferences as the chapeau on which sustainable development happens, this could be really very exciting and very important. Next slide, please. So this is my suggestion for how we should view Rio+20, whether it's a success or a failure, and where we go from here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ben. I hope you heard these applauses to you. And now it's time for questions. I think we could take a couple of questions. So please. Yes, Dede Yesenkulova from Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you very much for your intellectually engaging presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one concerns the issue of good governance. You showed actually the diagram of the 3 strands of sustainable development. Where would you put good governance? In which strand? Or is it something outside that encompasses all of those strands? And my maybe
Go ahead with the second.
And the second question is on the interrelationship between the 3 strands again, because, for instance, as part of our group assignment in this summer school and just general reading on this issue, I've noticed that sometimes some authors or some people try to separate this. This is economic development, this is environmental development, this is social development. And sometimes, again, it's, when we separate it, it's really hard to really work because it seems like at the end everything is related. It's hard to see clear-cut lines or boundaries among those strands. So what is your opinion on this issue? Is it possible to really say that this is something straight economic issue, economic sustainable development, this is something straight like environment? Or how do you see...
Thank you very much. Rahman, very good question.
So, did you hear everything? Hi, but did you hear the question?
Ушел на дно. At least after the lecture. At least after the end of the lecture.
Выключи еще раз.
Offline.
Hi Ben, you are back?
Okay. Yes, I'm back. I lost internet connection for a moment, but it seems to have come back, so my apologies. Okay, excellent question. With regards to the three strands, where governance fits in, and whether the distinction between them is artificial. I think that the two questions are related. I think governance comes in under the heading that in order to address these three different dimensions of sustainable development effectively, good governance is necessary. Good governance is necessary to have the capacity of public and private sector and also civil society institutions to make it possible to address the development challenges. If the government doesn't have the ability to identify development challenges, doesn't have the ability to plan for it, responding, doesn't have the finances to fund solutions, then we're not going to see the problem of the Geraldine Fraser Moleketi, the head of the Democratic Governance Practice in BDP in New York, says that if the economic, social, and environmental pillars are three pillars of sustainable development, then governance is the structure that the pillars support, that in turn ties the three pillars together. Now, when we talk about pillars as opposed to strands of sustainable development, this gets to the issue of whether or not it is in fact possible to separate the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development. Originally at Rio, 20 years ago at the Earth Summit, the reference was to the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, environmental, and social. And the metaphor of pillars has now increasingly been abandoned because you can't integrate pillars. Pillars are separate, standalone structures. And increasingly, we're using the metaphor of strands, like strands of hair that are braided together to create something bigger and more holistic, and if you like, more beautiful. Because in fact, any sustainable development solution has to integrate the social with the environment, with the economic dimension. So in that sense, it clearly is an artificial distinction, and it also reminds us that to be effective, sustainable development policy must integrate three strands. So, for example, poverty reduction that just focuses on economic growth is unlikely to be sustainable, because sooner or later it's going to run into unsustainable environmental policy, or it's going to come up against a lack of social development that will undermine the purpose it's trying to serve. So I completely agree, therefore, that we need integrated policy solutions that don't artificially separate out these three things as separate dimensions, but treat them as an integrated whole.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I think
Thank you
we
very
have
much.
time for two questions, Katarzyna and who else? Okay, let's start with Katarzyna.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. During the course, you also mentioned about the meta-governance level. And in your presentation, you said something how the development cooperation can be effective if everyone is a donor and playing by different rules, yes? And then you said something about the platform, that UN can be a platform to sustainable human development. So actually my question is it possible to make the UN something more than just platform, and just something more strong, more efficient, more effective, and so on, in the context of sustainable, in the context of development assistance?
I'm sorry, the audio is not very strong. Could you repeat that, please?
The question is that we had a presentation previously on meta-governance, and here is a question that UN is a sort of playground platform for all this. Question is, could we make UN something more powerful and more important for sustainable human development than just a playground or platform for movements?
Well, thank you very much for your question. It's excellent. In principle, of course, the answer is yes. The UN can play as large or as small a role as governments want to. The question really is, what do governments want? And I think there's a bit of double thinking here on the part of many governments. Governments recognize that there are global problems that exceed the ability of any individual government to solve, and therefore global governance institutions like the UN are necessary, and in some sense are becoming more necessary. On the other hand, governments are clearly concerned about the United Nations acting in ways that it does not have a mandate for. And this was a major issue in the Rio+20 negotiation. One of the reasons that we didn't have stronger support for many UN-sponsored initiatives, like the UN Secretary General's Sustainable Energy for All initiative, was because many member states thought this wasn't the UN business to do this. It did not have a mandate approved by member states via the General Assembly, which is, why is the UN doing this? It's acting like a rogue elephant, going off on its own. This is not what the UN should be doing. So, in principle, of course, the UN could play this role. I think it will increasingly move toward playing this role, in part because it will be financially lucrative to do so, not so much because the governments will pay for it, but increasingly the private sector and some NGOs and foundations will pay for it. But I don't think it's going to change overnight, and I think the UN's evolution in this respect will be slow and gradual and somewhat tortuous.
Thank you, Ben. And one last question from Sanita Dasgupta from India.
It was mentioned in the presentation regarding green development and brown development, and it was said that in the Rio conference there is a conflict between the two. But what I see of it is green development is related to brown development. So what is the difference? As in, why was there a conflict? And is it relating to some policy emission cuts, or what exactly is it about?
Did you hear this or shall I repeat?
Could you please repeat it for me, Mike?
What is the difference between green and brown development budget? Why there is conflict between them, and how does it relate? Does it relate to certain emission quota or something like that? And I think you had it on slide, that my addition. You had on slide something about worries about green policy.
Okay, great question. There's many dimensions to it. The first is that the question of what is green versus brown is to some extent subjective, and it's in the eye of the beholder. The most obvious example of this is in energy. We're all in favor of green, renewable energy. Many energy people, however, believe that nuclear power is renewable energy. But many environmentalists would not accept the proposition that nuclear power is green. And anyone who has lived through the consequences of Hello, sorry about that.
Hi, welcome back.
Okay, can you hear me? Hear me all right?
Yes, we're here.
Versus Brown is like the polder, using the example of nuclear power as something that some people would regard as green energy, others would not. It certainly causes no greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, it can do, well, when things go badly, a lot of environmental damage, as people who lived through the impact of Chernobyl in 1986 can attest to. So the first question is, we don't always agree on what is green and what is brown. But the second question is that some of the countries that are the greatest advocates of the green economy today, especially in Europe, owe their relatively high development levels to having undergone brown development for generations, if not centuries. Production of steel, automobiles based on coal, the extraction of iron ore. Countries like the United States, Japan, while the water quality may be quite good today, it certainly wasn't the case 50 years ago when these countries were industrialized, etc. So there's an intergenerational aspect that developing countries often say that the right to have a certain period of brown development is a right that the developed countries enjoy. The developing countries of the world today should also have that right. Now, this is to some extent difficult to argue with as a principle, but when you actually look at the costs of brown development for the world, if we are concerned about climate change, for example, then it gets a little bit harder to accept the argument that developing countries should be able to do whatever they want in order to develop, simply because developed countries did that in order to become rich. It's in some ways a reflection also of the fact that the world has changed.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
I don't know if that's a good image. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we will continue tomorrow with discussion of actors of sustainable human development, and tomorrow we have two interesting presentations, one on social economy from Poland and other on civil society from Bratislava, and we also will discuss the role of agency in sustainable human development. So thank you very much once again, and I think it was extremely interesting to look on Rio from the point of view of how different actors in sustainable human development interact with Rio and what happened there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.